Caliban and the Witch, Witch Hunting and Globalization. Witch hunting in America continued in waves through the end of the 17th century, when the persistence of demographic decline and increased political and economic security on the side of the colonial power structures combined to put an end to the persecution. Thus, in the same region that had witnessed the great anti-idolatry campaigns of the 16th and 17th centuries, by the 18th, the Inquisition had renounced any attempts to influence the moral and religious beliefs of the population, apparently estimating that they could no longer pose a danger to colonial rule. In the place of the persecution, a paternalistic perspective emerged that looked at idolatry and magical practices as the foibles of ignorant people not worthy of being taken into consideration by, quote, la gente de razón. From then on, the preoccupation with devil worshipping would migrate to the developing slave plantations of Brazil, the Caribbean, and North America, where, starting with King Philip's Wars, the English settlers justified their massacres of the Native American Indians by labeling them as servants of the devil. The Salem witch trials were also explained by the local authorities on this ground, with the argument that the New Englanders had settled in the land of the devil. As Cotton Mather wrote years later, recalling the events in Salem, quote, I have met with some strange things, which have made me think that this inexplicable war, i.e., the war made by the spirits of the invisible world against the people of Salem, might have its origins among the Indians, whose chief, Sagamores, are well known unto some of our captives to have been horrid sorcerers and hellish conjurers, and such as conversed with the demons. End quote. It is significant in this context that the Salem trials were sparked by the divinations of a West Indian slave, Tituba, who was among the first to be arrested, and that the last execution of a witch, in an English-speaking territory, was that of a black slave, Sarah Bassett, killed in Bermuda in 1730. By the 18th century, in fact, the witch was becoming an African practitioner of Obeah, a ritual that the planters feared and demonized as an incitement to rebellion. Witch hunting did not disappear from the repertoire of the bourgeoisie with the abolition of slavery. On the contrary, the global expansion of capitalism through colonization and Christianization ensured that this persecution would be planted in the body of colonized societies, and, in time, would be carried out by the subjugated communities in their own names and against their own members. In the 1840s, for instance, a wave of witch burnings occurred in western India. More women in this period were burned as witches than in the practice of sati. These killings occurred in the context of the social crisis caused both by the colonial authorities' attack on the communities living in the forests, among whom women had a far higher degree of power than in the caste societies that dwelled in the plains, and the colonial devaluation of female power, resulting in the decline of the worship of female goddesses. Witch hunting also took hold in Africa, where it survives today as a key instrument of division in many countries, especially those once implicated in the slave trade, like Nigeria and Southern Africa. Here, too, witch hunting has accompanied the decline in the status of women brought about by the rise of capitalism and the intensifying struggle for resources, which, in recent years, has been aggravated by the imposition of the neoliberal agenda. As a consequence of the life and death competition for vanishing resources, scores of women, generally old and poor, have been hunted down in the 1990s in northern Transvaal, where 70 were burned just in the first 4 months of 1994. Witch hunts have also been reported in Kenya, Nigeria, Cameroon, in the 1980s and 90s, concomitant with the imposition by the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank of the policy of structural adjustment, which has led to a new round of enclosures and caused an unprecedented impoverishment among the population. Footnote. On the renewed attention to witchcraft in Africa, conceptualized explicitly in relation to modern changes, see the December 1998 issue of The African Studies Review, which is dedicated to this topic. In particular, see Diane Siowakawi and Peter Geschir's Containing Witchcraft, Conflicting Scenarios in Post-Colonial Africa. Also see Adam Ashforth, Witchcraft, Violence, and Democracy in South Africa, and the video documentary Witches in Exile, produced and directed by Alison Berg in 2005. End of footnote. Picture: the Africanization of the witch reflected in the caricature of a Petroleus. Note her unusual earrings, cap, and African features, suggesting a kinship between the female communards and the, quote, wild African women, who instilled in the slaves the courage to revolt, haunting the imagination of the French bourgeoisie as an example of political savagery. End of caption. In Nigeria, by the 1980s, innocent girls were confessing to having killed dozens of people, while in other African countries, petitions were addressed to governments begging them to persecute more strongly the witches. Meanwhile, in South Africa and Brazil, older women were murdered by neighbors and kin under the charge of witchcraft. At the same time, a new kind of witch beliefs is presently developing, resembling that documented by Michael Tausig in Bolivia, whereby poor people suspect the nouveau riche of having gained their wealth through illicit, supernatural means, and accuse them of wanting to transform their victims into zombies in order to put them to work. The witch hunts that are presently taking place in Africa or Latin America are rarely reported in Europe and the United States, in the same way as the witch hunts of the 16th and 17th centuries, for a long time, were of little interest to historians. Even when they are reported, their significance is generally missed. So widespread is the belief that such phenomena belong to a far-gone era and have nothing to do with, quote, us. But if we apply to the present the lessons of the past, we realize that the reappearance of witch hunting in so many parts of the world in the 80s and 90s is a clear sign of the process of, quote, primitive accumulation, which means that the privatization of land and other communal resources, mass impoverishment, plunder, and the sowing of divisions in once cohesive communities are again on the world agenda. Quote, if things continue this way, the elders in a Senegalese village commented to an American anthropologist, expressing their fears for the future, quote, our children will eat each other, end quote. And indeed, this is what is accomplished by a witch hunt, whether it is conducted from above, as a means to criminalize resistance to expropriation, or is conducted from below, as a means to appropriate diminishing resources, as seems to be the case in some parts of Africa today. In some countries, this process still requires the mobilization of witches, spirits, and devils. But we should not delude ourselves that this is not our concern. As Arthur Miller already saw in his interpretation of the Salem trials, as soon as we strip the persecution of witches from its metaphysical trappings, we recognize in it phenomena that are very close to home. End of section.